Okay, let's get started then. I'll put the PowerPoint up in just a second. I am recording this, and I recorded the last one, but somehow it disappeared into the ether. So, but this one I hope to be able to store somewhere and then upload to YouTube page, and I'll give you the URL for that once it comes. I'm afraid I added a lot of names to the class list I had with the emails, but there were still a few today that didn't get the invite, and I suspect that I'm just working from an old list, so I'll get that updated from the registrar's office to try and avoid those things. Remember, you should really be using your CBU email, because that's the one I have. If you're using another one, then I just don't have that that email. Let me say one thing about the material we're covering today and the material we're going to cover for the next 3 classes, including today. It's by far the most difficult material that we will cover in this course. So I don't want you to get discouraged by this, and certainly don't think that, oh my goodness, this course is way above my head or anything of that sort. So I'm not presuming that you have any background in philosophy of law or philosophy in general. This is an introductory course. It has no prerequisites. So the material will get easier, and the material that we're covering now, I'll try and simplify to its very basics. And when you get down to some of the basics, it's not that complicated. Philosophers tend to write in complicated ways, and part of the task is seeing through that complication to get to the basic points. And part of my job is to interpret what's being said into more easily understood terms. So please don't give up. After this little bit of theory that we're going to do, we're going to move into more applied philosophy of law. And what I mean by that is we're going to look at actual judgments that are made in court, typically by the Supreme Court of Canada or a Supreme Court of one of the provinces on a particular case. So somebody maintains that the magazine you just produced or distributed, or the video you just distributed, should be illegal because it breaks some law against some aspect of indecent material, or whatever you want to call that. The producer of that material has to defend themselves in court, and sometimes that gets appealed all the way up to eventually the Supreme Court, and a judgment's made, and that sets a precedent for future cases. So if the court eventually says, we're going to define illegal pornography as some description of children or certain description of violence, everything else then, no matter how explicit sexually, will be okay. So those are the kinds of cases we're going to look at with respect to pornography, with respect to, say, Aboriginal issues, First Nations issues, with respect to freedom of speech. So that's the sort of thing we're going to look on after we get through this little tiny bit on some theoretical components of the philosophy of law. One other thing I'll say, if you have a question about what's in the reading or something I say in class, you're definitely not the only one who feels the same way. So please don't be afraid to ask a question, or to either vocally or in chat, and it will not only help you, but it will no doubt help others as well. Okay, so I hope we're all okay with that. For those who are here for the first time, on the Moodle page, there's a course outline, and you can download that, or you can look at it, and you'll see what materials we're going to cover, and roughly speaking when. Each class has a PowerPoint slideshow affiliated with it. I'm going to record the lectures, and hopefully, this will be my big experiment for the weekend, be able to upload it to a YouTube page and send you the address for that so you can look at it. Those YouTubes, by the way, since they're public, I would really appreciate it if you didn't share them to people outside the class. I don't know about you, but I'm not particularly comfortable even hearing my own voice, let alone seeing myself on a video, especially if it's distributed widely. So, I mean, there's nothing we're saying that's inappropriate here. It's just I'd rather it be kept as much within the group as possible. And they'll only be up for a certain amount of time. I don't know what that will be, but each test, I should have mentioned this last time, each test or assignment will examine you on the material we've covered either since the beginning, since the last test. So the first test you write at the end of this month, early next month, whichever it is, will be on the material we're covering now. The second test then will be on material that we cover between the first test and the second test. So they're not cumulative, except in a very general sort of sense. So I won't keep up videos of the lectures on YouTube longer than the tests that will cover that material. Okay, so let me share my screen. Here we go. No, let's go back. Okay, here we are. Yeah, okay, so this is the second class, and we're distinguishing here between, and we'll talk about just the first of these today, analytic jurisprudence. Analytic just means, as you would think, analyze, and it typically comes down to kind of definitional, theoretical questions. Normative jurisprudence will be where we spend some time looking at actual cases and how the courts decided as they did. In critical theories of law, well, I'm going to get to that slide in just a second. But they're basically going to look at whether or not the law as it currently exists in any society is truly fair and balanced, or does it give preference to one group over another, whether that's white males or whatever it is, and does it then unfairly discriminate against other groups like women or racialized people and so on. Today we're going to talk, as I said, about analytic jurisprudence, and this is, as I was saying before, a conceptual or definitional study, and it really looks at that basic question, well, what is the law and how does it differ, and in what ways is it the same as other norms? Norms are just the way we normally behave or the way we ought to behave, such as morality or ethics. And another big one that's discussed, and we'll discuss today, is from where, from what, or from whom does the law get its power or authority? I mean, the law is simply something, as we saw looking at those old tablets placed in a town square, or today some collection of books where the laws are written down. Why does that written word have authority and power to dictate how we're allowed to act, and more importantly, I suppose, how we're not allowed to act? What's so special about these words? Where does that authority come from? So that's one of the issues we'll be looking at today, and it's covered under, as I said, this branch of philosophy of law called analytic jurisprudence. Coming back to normative jurisprudence, where again we'll spend most of our time during this course after the first 2 weeks. We'll wonder what sort of norms or prescriptions define the law. What's a prescription? Well, this this deals with the distinction that's often made between description and prescription. Description is an attempt to describe, that is to say what the case actually is, or the way the world actually is. It deals with facts. Prescriptions are attempts to tell us how we ought to behave. So they deal with values, legal values, moral values, whatever. But so there's this fact-value distinction. They're related in some ways. So if you're trying to discover whether somebody is guilty of something and should be sent to prison, let's say, you need to know certain facts of the matter. So there's relationships between the two, but there's that fundamental difference between one, facts saying this is what actually happened, and values saying this is what we think about what happened and what we should do as a result of what happened. So as I said, that's where we'll be spending most of our time. In part, this will include what are the proper limits of the law. And here we get a distinction, I briefly mentioned it last time, between what you might call a personal morality and what's a more public morality, and also what's legal. So we have personal opinions about a whole wealth of things in our lives, and those can come from various sources. We could have learned them from our parents. We could have learned them through our peer group. We could have thought long and hard about it. We could have gotten it from your religious organization, your temple, your church, your whatever. And they form what you believe to be the way in which you ought to behave. So those influences and your thoughts, your beliefs, give you a prescription for how you ought to behave. As we all know, for one reason or another, we don't always behave as we think we ought to. So sometimes the facts of our behavior and what we hope to, and what we want to, how we want to behave are sometimes different. See if anybody just came in. Yes, I am here. Okay. So what does that have to do with the proper limits of the law? Well, we live in a country that is founded on a couple of basic ideas. One is we're a democratic country. So we think that the people who represent us in government ought to be chosen by us. So that if you're running for your local municipal office, or you're running for mayor, or you're running to be a member of the provincial legislature or a member of the federal parliament, you have to go out and try and convince a majority of the people, or at least more than anybody else, that you should be the person to represent. So that's a representative democracy. Ultimately, laws are going to be made up by however they think that should be made up in a country like Canada, in any other, almost any other country I can think of. It's that body, they don't necessarily aren't elected bodies in all places, but there's some body that decides this is going to be legal and that's going to be illegal. In Canada and a bunch of other countries that are representative democracies, we also think that it's important that there are certain rights enshrined for individuals, whether or not those individuals are within the majority viewpoint or not. What does that mean? Well, it means that when we elect somebody to lead us, we've said that they represent the majority. but that could be 50% of the people plus one. That would leave 49% of the population who is left out. And it might be that there might be some racism, some sexism, or a whole bunch of other things between what the majority thinks and what the minority wants. So it's necessary then to protect ourselves against the majority. When democracies first came in, they were in the Western world, in Europe initially, and in the US, they were thought to, they were an attempt to rid ourselves of despotic monarchical governments, kings and queens ruling us and deciding what the laws were and what we were allowed to do and not allowed to do. And they thought, we need to be able to control those laws ourselves. And so we ought to elect our officials and not have them come down through some edict that they were born into a certain family at a certain time. And then people began to realize that, well, democracies are all well and good, but the majority can be just as tyrannical as any monarch could be. So we still have to protect individuals who don't want to live in the same way as the majority want to live. Now, obviously, we can't allow people to do just anything. So if no matter how much you want to murder the person sitting next to you on the bus, we're going to say that's not allowed. That's illegal. There'd be very, very few circumstances in which we determine that that was not illegal. It would have to be something like you weren't mentally competent at the time, so you're then proven guilty, but you're mentally unfit to stand trial, or you could be in a situation of self-defense or something along those lines. But typically speaking, in the vast majority of cases, you're not allowed to kill somebody else. However, there are issues about which there's disagreement about between individuals, their personal morality or their group morality. So think about something like abortion, which is the termination of a pregnancy, before the baby comes to term, that is before its birth. Some people think that that is a kind of murder, and hang on, I'm looking at chat. Okay, okay. Sorry if you didn't receive the invite, Sanchita. I thought I sent it out because I remember your name, but we'll have to maybe talk about that later. Okay, so we've got lots of people in society that think that that should be an illegal action. And it might even be the case that the majority thinks that. And yet, for some reason or another, the parliament and or the courts have decided that on the basis of something or other, and we'll talk about this as we go through cases of this sort, that though some people consider these actions immoral and not something they should do, it should be something that that is at least tolerated as a legal action, even if you would not do it. You can think of pornography in a similar kind of sense. Pornography is not for me, but outside of certain kinds of restrictions, we're going to decide that it should be available for others because it, well, for whatever reason, because we think it's an important part of free speech and we value that, so on and so forth. So, but this question about what are the proper limits of the law is one that we'll come back to again and again in this course. in various different ways, whether it's got to do with cases about abortion, cases about pornography and speech, cases about, I'm drawing a blank here, but you'll look through if you look through the outline, you'll see that we're looking at a great variety of cases that draw upon what the proper limits of the law are. The last normative question here, we're not going to talk about much at all. Particularly, we're not going to look at the first one. We're not going to look at theories of punishment and why we think they're morally acceptable or not acceptable. We're not going to look, for example, at the question of whether or not capital punishment or death penalties are morally acceptable or not. In Canada, legally speaking, at any rate, this is no longer an issue, or at least a contentious one. In Canada, throughout the whole country, the death penalty is invalid. You cannot serve that. You cannot be condemned to death, regardless of what you did. Whether or not that's right or wrong is a question that we're just not going to get into in this. More specific question in certain cases about whether the punishment fits the crime, I can't remember off the top of my head whether we get into that or not. But anyway, those are the kinds of issues that would be looked at in the area of normative jurisprudence, where again, I say we're going to spend most of our time. So go back. One, there's analytic jurisprudence that looks at the stuff we're going to look at today and then move on from it. And looking at these kind of basic abstract questions, what's the law, where does it get its authority, to these normative questions about how we interpret the law, what ought to be the law in certain kinds of cases. And then finally, there are critical legal studies or feminist jurisprudence. And this is the newest branch in the philosophy of law, really mid-20th century on, I would say. And these cases look to see whether or not the law either intentionally or unintentionally is biased against certain groups. Now, if you look at certain kinds of laws in the past, so for example, women weren't allowed to vote in Canada until, I should know this exactly, but I don't, it was the early 1920s. So the law that was constructed that said only men could vote and women couldn't was absolutely...
it was 1940.
1940?
40?
Oh my.
Yeah.
In Canada? For women to get to vote?
Yes, Quebec. Like, women could not vote in Quebec until 1940.
Wow. Okay. I thought it was much sooner than that. Somebody here will know when First Nations peoples were allowed to vote. That was later. I think
it was 1960.
Yeah, thank you. And
women could vote in Canada in 1916 when
there
was a case.
1916, yes.
Yes, that was the case related to that. I remember the case, the person's case. Do you know the person's case?
I don't remember the person, no.
Yes, that was a case where the women used to deal. There were 5 women in Alberta. It's the case of Alberta, basically. And that was dealt by Justice McLaughlin. And in that, the women had, like, there was one woman, what I read in autobiography of McLaughlin was that there was one woman and she was fighting for her place in... Sorry?
She couldn't have been the judge who made that decision, though, correct? She just writes about it.
Sorry?
Oh, no, not important. McLaughlin, though, is fairly recent member of the Supreme Court, right? She wasn't around.
Yes, yeah. She was the one who passed a judgment for person's case. Yeah.
Okay. So these laws were very much intentional. They were meant to be exclusionary, and they certainly were. There are other kinds of biases that are not so clearly intentional or not so clearly above board, if you can use that odd sort of phrase. So let's say you're looking for, I don't know. Well, let's take a case like a member of the police. So you're looking to let somebody into police school, and although there's nothing specific that says that you can't allow women in the ranks of the police force, you might have certain requirements to enter police school, like say being 5'9" or above, that excludes an awful lot of women, excludes the vast majority of women. It might also be discriminatory, biased against certain races who tend not to be as tall as some other races. So those kinds of things are much more difficult to uncover as biases. And that's when we get into discussions about systemic racism. So at least on the, formally speaking, Canada is not, does not have, or let's at least say this for the sake of argument, racist laws. It doesn't have sexist laws either, or let's say that for the sake of argument at least. And yet you could still say that our society is guilty of systemic racism and sexism. That's a big part of the discussion that's going on right now, particularly revolving around the Black Lives Matter movement. So they have to point to some evidence about that, but that's the sort of thing that critical legal studies and feminist philosophy of law will look at. We will get into some of that as we look at particular cases. Let's say about pornography, because feminism has been very vocal, not a homogeneous voice about pornography, but at least at certain times, feminism has been very much involved in the discussion about what ought to be deemed unacceptable in terms of what we can view or listen to or read. Okay, so does anyone have any questions about these three components of the philosophy of law? Analytical jurisprudence that we're going to talk about in the time we have remaining today. Normative jurisprudence, where we're going to spend most of our time through the course, and critical legal studies, which we're going to look at in cases as they come up. Any questions about those?
That's okay. No questions.
Okay, thank you. So, as I said, one of the main questions that comes up in analytical jurisprudence is whether or not the law is connected to morality, and if so, how? Here there are three main theories. There's one that's called natural law theory. We're going to go through and explain all of these. There's another that's called legal positivism, and there's a third one that tries to combine the two in a certain sort of way. And it was put forward by this guy named Ronald Dworkin. And sometimes it's called interpretivist, or constructivist legal theory. And so we'll look briefly at it too. The oldest one of these is this natural law theory, which was established by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. But it goes back even further than that, really, because St. Thomas Aquinas was a student, not literally, because he lived, 1,500 years later, but was a follower of the writings of Aristotle. You might, if you know anything about Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, there were three main figures: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And they occurred in that order. Socrates lived first. He was kind of an informal teacher of Plato. And then Plato was a teacher of Aristotle. So they agreed on some things, they also disagreed on some things. St. Thomas Aquinas was really a follower of Aristotle in certain lines of his thinking, although he obviously Christianized Aristotle's thought, because Aristotle is pre-Christian, and Aquinas is certainly Christian. And so what were the main tenets with respect to this question? Where's the law get its authority, and how's it connected to morality? And this is, in its strongest form, is explained in terms of this thing that's called the overlap thesis. And so what that says is that the law of nature, being coeval, and that just means that the law of nature came around as the same time as mankind or humankind. So nature and humans came into being around the same time. And both nature and humankind were dictated by God himself. God, of course, is the creator. And it's his law, God's law, that we must follow according to natural law theory. It's binding all over the globe, in all countries, at all times, and so on. No human laws are of any validity if they're contrary to this divine law, and such of them as are valid derive all their force and all their authority, either directly or indirectly, mediatively or immediately, from this original. So the theory that the law has moral force, the reason why we need to follow the law under this thesis is that the law itself comes from God, the supernatural being who created us and created nature. So in a sense, you can't have a kind of stronger moral base than to say that you got to follow the law because it's the law of the supreme being who created you and controls you in a certain sort of way. It'll bring up questions about, well, how do we know what God's law is? How do we figure that out? We'll come to that in a second. When we look at what's natural about natural law theory, because we talked about it comes from God, but God's law is revealed in nature. What does that mean? Well, according to Aristotle originally, the universe is what he called teleological. That's a big word that simply means everything, according to Aristotle, had a purpose, and that purpose was put there by God himself. So human beings have a purpose. Cows have a purpose. Rivers have a purpose. The sun has a purpose. Moreover, our individual parts have a purpose. So, for example, Aristotelian notions about legitimate sexuality would be that sexuality uses particular organs, our genital organs, and the purpose of those organs are for reproduction. That's what they're designed to do. To use them in a way outside of that, then, is dysteleological and immoral. As I said, Aquinas takes that thought and Christianizes it. So so using something in a way that's it's not meant for, not designed for, is, according to Aristotle and later Aquinas and the Roman Catholic Christian Church, is sinful. And so And ultimately, we are going to be judged according to this theory in an everlasting life, the life after this one, according to our actions in this life. And so lots of religions, Hinduism believes in a life after death. It's certainly involved in this notion of reincarnation, and how you lived your life will determine what kind of life form you come back into. The Christian notion is not so circular. It's sort of, you've lived this life, and your next life is going to be either up or down. It's going to be, if you lived a good life, you're going to heaven. If you lived a bad life, you're going to hell. So that's why, in a sense, you should, or at least one main reason you should obey the law. If we are smart enough, if we think about it hard enough, we can find out what the purposes of things are, what the telos of everything in nature is, nature and its parts. So in this way, we discover what the law is because we discover what nature is. And he thinks, Aristotle thinks through reason. The Christian church says it's through reason and belief. So and faith. So it raises this notion of faith as well as reasonable. That natural law theory tends to put a lot of emphasis on reason. So the law is not created, well, sorry, it is created by God, but it's not created by humans. The natural law is something God made and not ours. Now, there's all kinds of questions about this. We're not going to get into this, but science, contemporary science rejects a teleological conception of things. There's questions about what parts of nature reveal God's purpose. So you've got some animals that are aggressive, some passive. How do we interpret that properly? Who gets to interpret it? Scientists, priests, the person on the street. So those are some of the issues, but it's been a tremendously influential theory, and it was particularly influential until the Reformation, when the Catholic Church, step back just for a second. There was one Catholic Church at the beginning. It had two sides to it. The Catholic side, based in Rome, the Roman Catholic side, and the Eastern Orthodox side, based in Constantinople, and now called Istanbul. And eventually the two sides disagreed enough that they split. And so there were two Catholic churches, Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic. Later on, in more Northern Europe especially, there was a group of people, Protestants, who protested the way the church was. That's what it means to be a Protestant. You protested the way the church was, the Roman Catholic Church was set up, and you developed something new. When that Reformation occurred, there was a new theory of law that came about in Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, we talked about in last class. He was the guy who came up with that theory of the Leviathan. And he comes up with a different theory of law that's called positivism. Come back to that in just a second as we look at this theory put forward by a philosopher of law called Lon Fuller. Not all natural law theorists are as Catholic or even as Christian as Aquinas was, and followers of his in the contemporary world. Fuller has a much weaker form of natural law theory, and it's expressed in these 8 laws. And Fuller says for a law to be genuine, it must feature all of these aspects. So it must be expressed in general terms. It must be public. You can't have laws that are hidden. Nobody knows what the heck the law would be. So you can't have private laws. They have to be public. They can't be directed at specific people. They've got to be generalized. They've got to be prospective. That is, they've got to look forward into the future. The law must be understandable. The law is no good if nobody understands what's being said, and that happens sometimes when a case gets to, say, the Supreme Court or a provincial Supreme Court, where they say this law is no good. The government wrote this law, but it's no good because nobody understands it. Nobody can determine whether if they do X, that's going to be moral or that's going to be considered legal or illegal. So you can't have that. Laws must be consistent with one another. So you can't have one law saying that X is okay, it's legal, and another law saying that same action X is illegal, or the reverse. I can't remember what I said. And so on and so forth. So this leaves out a lot of that God talk, to put it that way, but looks at minimal requirements of what laws must have. Then we move on to positivism. As I say, a later formulation. Now, when positivism came along, it wasn't as if natural law theorists all disappeared. They continued to exist in today's world. Long Fuller is one of them. So, but here was a new way of thinking about what the law is and where it gains its power and what its relationship to morality is. Remember, Hobbes was that guy who said that if we lived in a state where there were no laws to guide our behavior, that life would be pretty darn horrible. Everybody just go around murdering and maiming and raping and so on, because there were nothing to prevent that. And remember, he said that the way to get out of this was to have a monarch, to have, and he said a monarch, but it would be any state that was powerful enough to control people's behavior, such that if you broke the law, you would be punished for it. And so in Hobbes' thinking, people lead the state of nature into a state of law, civil society, by giving their arms up to the state, in his case, the monarch, and so that you have given away your power, and you've given that away to get to a peaceful state, because the state of nature is a state of war. So nobody wants that. So Hobbes says what people have to do is give up their power to a state, and the state will ensure peace. And it can do that because it will have sufficient power. There are three commitments in this theory. Here, unlike natural law theory, legal validity and authority comes from a human convention. Like, okay, we're all going to decide that this person or this group of people is going to have all the power in society, and we're going to listen to them. Why are we going to listen to them? Because without them, our life is a misery. It's a war of all against all. So that's a human decision, and hence a human convention.
Sorry.
Yep.
Just when we switched over to sides, my audio went really, really choppy. If you don't mind repeating what you said, sorry.
Sure. So I'll go back here. So did you get the part about Hobbes saying that states are constructed, come into existence when the people decide to follow somebody and give up all their power to that individual or that group of people. Did you get that part?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Then the next one is that if that's what happens, if people decide to give up their power to an individual or a group, and that that's how that individual or group gets its authority to tell us what to do. That's what the law is. It's the result of a human convention. It's the result of human decisions. It's not the result of, and we can call that a social contract if we want. It's the authority of law comes from that social contract, that agreement we make, and it doesn't come from God at all. So God is removed from the picture in positivist legal theory. So that all laws get their authority by convention. Those could be, so for example, we've got to have a notion of who can create the law. So in a country like Canada, we have rules and conventions about how you get elected. And then there are rules and conventions about, and laws about who gets to lead the government. Then there are rules and conventions about who can propose laws and whether those pass through Parliament. If they pass through Parliament and they get accepted by Senate and they get signed by the Governor General, they become a law. All of those are conventions, and that's how we get a law. I'm not going to go through this thing about social fact thesis and John Austin and H.L.R. Hart. Please feel free to look at it, but the main idea here is between natural law theory, thinking that the law gets its authority from God. The legal positivists think that it's all human constructed and comes from human conventions. In saying this, legal positivists think that the law and morality are conceptually distinct. That's not to say they never overlap. Hopefully, I mean, it'd be very, very weird if none of our laws overlapped with what we think is moral. But there's no necessary connection to the two. So a law will still be a law if it's formulated in a correct process and accepted by people as such. That's still the law of the land. I mean, we can say that, and we ought to say it's an immoral law, but positivists will still say, but it's the law. Natural law theorists will say that, no, humans can devise things and think it's the law, but it really isn't. Because God's law never changes. It's the way the world is. It's the way God created it. So there's that difference. Finally, and I don't want to go into this in any detail either, this constructivism or interpretivist part. Let me try and explain this in as simple terms as I can. If we go back to this idea that, where is it? Here we are. That the law comes from a social contract. So imagine hypothetically that people are living in what Hobbes called a state of nature, and they're killing each other, and they've decided, oh my God, this is horrible. What can we do to get out of this? Hypothetically, they all get together and sign a contract according to the social contract theory. So they come and say, okay, I'm going to give up this so I can get that. Just like you do when you go in to buy something, you say, we don't really bargain much over much in Canada, but let's say you're going to buy a car. There's some bargaining that goes on there, and they tell you, well, it's $20,000, and you say, no, I'll give you 15, and then you agree on 18 or something like that. But you sign a contract to that through your negotiations. That's how the positivist theory thinks it is, what people actually agree to. And that's the law. Now, what this guy, John Rawls, it's not Jan Rawls, it's John Rawls, sorry, is it's a social contract theory, but it has certain kinds of limits on it. So you probably know that if you're in a position of weakness and you try and bargain with somebody, they're mostly going to get the best deal. That's because they hold more of the power. So we could say that, yeah, ultimately you agreed to something, but maybe you don't think it's fair because you had no choice. So it doesn't seem like just, even if you agreed to it. So, you know, you'll accept $5 an hour for working because if you don't accept it, you won't get anything. But making $5 an hour, you might say, is still not just and fair, even if you agreed to it. So in a very, very complicated system, Rawls tries to formulate a social contract theory that's way more just and way more fair. That's why his system is called justice and fairness, where people make bargains from a state of equality and not from a position of differential power. And that's sort of what that's sort of like what Dworkin argues with his constructivist interpretivist theory, that the law isn't just what social convention is, because there are lots of times where judges, especially in a common law system, have to interpret how the law should apply. And they will try and be as fair as they can, so that they will choose, as it says in point 2 here, the principle that is most morally attractive standard. So we give people the benefit of the doubt, and the law tries to be, when there's discrepancy, it tries to be as fair as possible. It tries, ideally, not to take advantage of people that are that have the least power in society. That's my talk for today. I know that's a lot of material. I know it's pretty darn abstract. My hope, at least, is that I've been able to make it more accessible than it was when you read through the material. I'm hoping that if you go back and look at the slides again, you'll be able to make some sense of it. Again, I'm looking for the basic points here to go back. You know, so I want you to understand what analytic jurisprudence does. In general, what's it doing? What's the law and how does it get its authority? And we talked about three theories about how the law gets its authority. One is natural law theory that says the law gets its authority from God. We've got legal positivism that says that we get our, the law gets its authority from contracts and conventions that humans sign with one another. God's got nothing to do with it. And we've got this third one, this constructivist or interpretivist one that says the law gets its authority by conventions that humans sign, but also with a background idea of what is moral and just and fair. So it adds some sort of independent morality to the legal framework that is absent from the positivist picture. So that's what I want you to know about analytical jurisprudence in very simple terms. I mean, there's a few details there along the way, but if you get that basic idea, then you've got the main and most important points. Normative jurisprudence is something, as I said, these bullet points explain most of what it's about, and it will be where we spend a lot of our time this term, looking at how to interpret what ought to be the case, how to interpret what the law is and what the law ought to be. And we'll talk about issues like what's the proper limit of the law, how much freedom should people have, and how much constraint should the law provide to people's behavior. And finally, critical legal studies, feminist jurisprudence critically analyzes existing laws to uncover hidden biases against certain groups, whether they're racial groups, sex groups, gender groups, whether some people are discriminated against unfairly because of their political ideology. That's what critical legal studies and feminist jurisprudence does. Those will come up at times when we look at specific issues that really center around race or sex or ideology. Okay, does anyone have any questions?
No, everything is clear.
Ah, thank you very much. I hope that's a sentiment shared around the class. I did say that because we don't, we're not going. It's just a medium in which it's harder to ask questions, harder to get into discussions. So classes will be probably like today, a little short, about an hour long and not an hour and 15 minutes long. I could care less about that. I hope you don't think that you're not getting your money's worth because we end a little bit early if we do end a little early. But that's my class for today. I'm going to now try and save this recording and then post it up to a YouTube channel as soon as I can. I'll send out an invite early next week for your class next Wednesday, and hopefully I will get a new class list and check it against this one of people who have missed at times, and we won't have that issue about people having to email me to let me know that you didn't get an invite. I mean, that's exactly what you should do if you don't get an invite.
Make sure everybody gets the invite, because this time I was waiting for 15 minutes, then I had to call my friend to ask for my invitation, because three of my friends did not receive that.
Sorry, say that again. What was it?
I said three to four friends of mine. We did not receive the invitation for today's class.
Okay.
I had to ask my friend to send me the joining ID.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So please make sure that everybody gets the invite for next class.
Okay. And again, if somebody does not get an invite for the next one by, let's say, next Tuesday afternoon, if you haven't got it by then, email me and I'll send you an invite. But hopefully, we're getting better. I mean, there were a ton of people missed the first class. There were less missed this one, but still too many. So hopefully we get better as we go along. Okay.
I know it's hard to do online, but we are getting here, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great, everybody. See you next week. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.